We're joined by a fantastic panel. Damien Green, the MP for Ashford, former Deputy Prime Minister, very involved in obviously in all the Brexit negotiations that we've seen up to now, and now involved in a different kind of negotiation, if the papers are right, to try and bring a rapprochement between the more moderate wing of the Conservative Party and the harder line parts. And Saeed Kamal, who is the Professor of International Relations and Politics at St Mary's University, also the Director of Studies at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and formerly, until May this year, MEP representing London. And Roland Freudenstein, the Policy Director of the Martin Centre in Brussels, which is a political think tank with the mission of helping decision makers formulate new policy options, particularly in relation to the EU. Welcome. And whilst I don't think we all would want to focus too much on Brexit, it would seem to be a missed opportunity not to ask you to reflect, Damien, a little on how we have got here, where we are going, and to put it another way, if in 5 years' time somebody from overseas was seeking to engage with the centre-right of British politics, would they look to the Conservative Party, and would they even have a United Kingdom in which to have that discussion?
Thank you. If we're trying to finish at 7:20 and somebody else wants to get a word in edgeways, I might elide some of your questions, all of which are entirely valid. But I'm still reading from being introduced after a disquisition on Heraclitus, which is a new one for any gathering I've ever done. You're quite right. It's great to be able. I mean, thank you all for coming, and James and everyone who's organised this. This is a brilliant idea, partly because it enables us all to think slightly long term. The short term nature of current politics, I thought, was illustrated perfectly when at about 11:30 in the morning, I accepted, one day this week, I accepted an interview round to talk about the letter I wrote to the Prime Minister saying, please, can we have all these good colleagues back in the party? And by the time I'd arrived on College Green to do that interview round, the Prime Minister's brother had resigned from the government, and therefore I found myself doing interviews on a completely other subject. So long term in politics at the moment is after lunch. So let me boil down what I think is going to happen. I think I mean, we can all argue for days about how we got here, but looking ahead, I think rather unfashionably, particularly unfashionably among my closest friends and allies in politics, I think the government is sincere about wanting a deal. I think that the noises I get coming out are that, of course, it's very difficult. Of course, doing it by the end of next month is sensationally difficult. But actually, the movement is in that direction. So I don't think we should entirely give up on the thought that for all the Sturm und Drang that we've had over recent days, that actually it's possible that over the next 6 or 7 weeks or so, we will leave with the deal, which will be what many Conservatives have been aiming at for a very long time. And I'm absolutely sure that the Prime Minister would prefer to do that. But I think almost whatever happens in the immediate future, it's one of the tasks, you talk about the centre-right going forward. I think one of the tasks of all politicians and all those who care about politics in Britain through the 2020s will be trying to devise a new architecture for Britain's relationship with other countries in Europe. It won't be the same as our membership of the European Union, but the European Union itself will change. But it seems to me unarguable that obviously we need good relations, and there are areas outside the trade arguments that have dominated, the arguments about some of the big ideas that Alex was talking about security. We will need a security relationship that's very important. We'll need an environmental relationship that's very important. We'll need things like data standards in a world of AI and big data and all of that. All of those things we will need, not just, as it were, a deal with the European Union. I'm sure we will need permanent structures that enable both sides, as it were, to develop together. So I think that's one of our big tasks for the 2020s. And the other sort of two areas I want to cover are broadly covered by the question, how miserable should we be? Should we all be in absolute despair about the future of politics. And since you may have seen the rather cheering scientific research recently showing that optimists live longer than pessimists and are healthier than them, I will be, in the terms of current political debate, moderately optimistic. One of the issues is populism, because, I mean, to answer directly your point, Caroline, of, will people be dealing with the Conservative Party? Yes, is the short answer to that. I think for all the tectonic plate shifting that is alleged to be going on with Brexit, I think that once Brexit has happened, actually, and politics won't go back to where it was before, but politics will broadly go on to the left versus the right, and there will need to be a centre-right party, which will be the Conservative Party. And so one of the questions for that party and for every party is, how do we combat populism, which has come about for all sorts of reasons since the crash of 2008 across Europe. It's not by any means a British phenomenon. In fact, I think the British versions of it are, as so often in this country, rather gentler than versions that happen in other countries. So we're relatively well off. But straightforwardly, and to be very brief, the two things we need to do are sort the economy and defend our institutions. And by institutions, I mean political institutions, as well as things like an independent judiciary and a free press. And that ought to be a particularly congenial task for people on the centre-right. I think one of the more significant statements in the rash of stuff we've had recently was Robert Buckland's instant rush to the defence of an independent judiciary yesterday as Lord Chancellor. I was very glad to hear a Lord Chancellor do that. And the only other area I think we ought to think about is demographics. Again, in the context of don't be depressed. The fact that we live in an ageing society is always seen as a problem. That it will mean that there are more people who need more care and bigger pensions for longer, and that this is terrible. Actually, it's something we ought to be celebrating. If we can keep people, all of us, healthy for longer, then all this is a straightforward improvement in the quality of life for millions of people for longer. What's not to like? We'll need to do lots of things. We'll need to retrain people so that we make a reality of what's become a cliche, lifelong learning, which all politicians, including me, use all the time. I don't observe anything like that happening anywhere. We will need to obviously change the way we regard health care and as well as social care. But actually, this is a good thing, the fact that we're all living longer, not a bad thing. And my final brief thought is that everyone should remember that properly regulated capitalism works. No other economic system is agile enough to cope with the new challenges we'll be facing in the 2020s and beyond. And at the root of our political argument should always be that point, that a properly regulated free market system not only provides more prosperity for more people, but also enables societies to cope with technological change and other challenges much better than any centralised control system. Thank you.
Thank you. Syed, you were closely involved with discussions between the British government and the European Parliament when you were a parliamentarian and commission. Do you see, given the heat of the disagreements between Britain and the European Union at the moment, do you see possibility that those structures that Damien referred to us needing to create will be created swiftly?
I think it will take time. And I think at the moment, in some ways, we still speak different languages in some ways. I think one of the things that I became aware of, for those of you who don't know what I did before, I was the leader of the European Conservative Reformist Group, which was the third largest group in the European Parliament, and effectively made me, without blowing my own trumpet, the sort of most senior elected Brit in the European Parliament. And therefore, whenever leaders and commissioners came to speak to the group leaders, they would inevitably ask me about Brexit. And then I would send messages back to number 10, and it would go both ways. And one of the things that struck me during my time, probably one of my frustrations, was how we spoke different languages. We never communicated clearly to the EU negotiators, and Michel Barnier would say this a number of times to me as well as people in Parliament, what we actually wanted in their language. We kept saying closest possible relationship. Closest possible relationship actually means nothing. And what I think they wanted to hear was templates. Which template do you want? Is it Canada plus plus plus? Is it EA minus minus, or EA minus or whatever? Interestingly enough, the agreement that came through is seen now as a sort of customs union plus or customs union minus. So that's why they were able to agree on that. bizarrely, it's the UK could say it's the closest possible relationship, whereas the EU could say, actually, we understand this in terms of our existing templates, as it were. But actually, if we had asked, for example, for Canada plus, as long as we defined all the pluses, we could have had that conversation. I remember sitting down with a couple of European Europe ministers and all the group leaders in the Parliament and a couple of commissioners, and they said, what would you ask for? And I said, look, they said, we know you don't have the authority, but what would you ask for? And I said, I would ask for Canada plus. And we started discussing the pluses: financial services, security cooperation, intelligence cooperation. And they said, that makes sense to us, but you're not asking for that. Or even if you want to ask for EA minus or whatever. So I think that was really one of the problems. I think going back, I could foresee this in some ways. I'm not saying I'm particularly prophetic more than anyone else, but I became an MEP in 2005, and it became pretty clear to me pretty quickly that there's a massive gap in perceptions about the EU itself. Speak to my colleagues who want further political integration. Some would talk openly about the United States of Europe, for example. Some would talk Federal Republic. Come back to the UK, we saw it very much as a transactional relationship, trade plus. And it was very interesting, even after towards the end of my time, I used to have a regular breakfast with the leaders of the largest delegations from the various Christian Democrat parties, the CDU, the French, the Spanish Parti Popular, the Italians. And they said, we hope one day you'll rejoin the EPP, for those of you who know this stuff. And we said to them, well, there's a fundamental difference between us. You want a country. We don't. Oh yeah, that's fine, but that won't happen for 20 years. We never had these conversations over here. And I think that gap in perception, actually, I think may ensure that at some stage we were going to have that, I think that sort of either break or confirmatory. I think the referendum had gone the other way, or to confirm that we were staying in something that would have entailed political union.
So the Brits are not renowned for their ability to speak foreign languages.
Yeah.
This has been this painful episode. Do you think it has allowed us to understand the European language that we need to speak in order to create the structures to flourish together?
No, I don't think so, but I think what it has done is actually got more people in this country, whatever their view, interested in the European issue. And I think more people are actually interested in the EU as a result. For different reasons. But I think what actually both sides need to do is look forward. And one of the things that I do in my academic job as a professor of international relations, one of the things we're looking at is the UK's future international relations, foreign policy, and the EU's future foreign policy. And we tend to, obviously, as you can imagine, as academics, we tend to look in sort of various theories. So there's a realist theory that looks at state power, for example. And some people will say this enhances the state power of the UK. Others would say it weakens the state power of the UK as a strong, using your strength. Then there's the sort of liberalist, not necessarily correlated directly with liberalism, but a liberalist international view, which it all has to be about relationships, and you can't, in the interdependency. And others will say, well, actually, there are some strengths that the UK has that it could use in those relationships. It's military, it's relative military power, it's free trade, it's some of its other, its seat on some of the international organisations, for example. That's something powerful to use, not as a realist argument, but actually as a sort of liberal cooperation argument. Then there are the sort of constructivists, if you like. Sorry to get theoretical. And what that means is that you've got to decide how you see yourself. And I think one of the things that the UK has to decide is how it sees itself post-Brexit. Are we a kind of hub for what we would hope, liberty, free trade, open markets, tolerance, and can we help promote those internationally via international institutions and with our partners in relationships, or do we go a sort of a more insular way? And then finally, there are institutionalists who kind of overlap with the liberalists, who say it's important that those relationships, whether they are formal institutions such as the EU or UN, or whether you have relationships as informal networks to tackle particular issues. It could be deforestation, it could be environmentalism, it could be people trafficking, it could be migration issues. If you work in networks like that, then actually that's very powerful. I think whatever one's view has been on Brexit, I can see, particularly from the centre-right, we are very internationalist. I don't think there are very few Conservatives, I think, who want to be isolationists. I suspect they've left and joined other parties, to be frank. And I think, we see that cooperation, and I've heard the phrase many times, we want to be good neighbours, not reluctant tenants. Even from those who, are kind of the more libertarian-minded globalists who want to leave, as opposed to sort of friends who are, some of my conservative friends who are more Christian democratic, as it were.
So my question was whether the absence of Britain from the discussions in Europe about the projection of Europe, the European continent overseas, will change how Europe projects itself overseas and what impact that'll have on the global picture.
And thank you for having me. James, we've been working together for about 15 years now. And we still are. Fantastic. So I mean, it's a great honor, and also as a German, to be here with three distinguished English persons. Well, before I come to your question, Carol, give me that little bit of leeway as the guest from the continent. Let me tell you, my favorite sequel of Fawlty Towers, logically, is called The Germans. So looking at the generational average around this room, I think you know what I'm talking about. So you remember that Basil, played by John Cleese, tells everyone not to mention the war. And then, of course, he ends up mentioning it all the time. So I mean, when Monday afternoon, Cara and I had a phone conversation about this, I was told in no uncertain terms not to mention Brexit. and they're doing nothing else.
Yes,
they're doing nothing else all the time.
Change the rules.
You started it. Right. No, but I am not going to mention Brexit for the moment. I'll try, I'll try my best. I'll bite my tongue. Because I want to come back to Cara's question. The global picture and the mother of parliaments, and actually the two oldest democracies in the West look from the other Western countries like they're jumping ship. I'm putting it very simply and very brutally. That's the way it looks like from outside of Britain and the United States. So, when I looked at the five topics of IN2030, I immediately thought that there is a sixth one, which I would put very high up on the agenda, which pops up in two of the areas, in the security and in the digital one, but I would seriously give it a separate column, and that's the future of liberal democracy, which is threatened from the outside of the West by Russia and China and non-governmental actors. But I mean, will you wait for China? China is beginning to make its influence felt inside our democracies with different means than Russia, but probably in the long term no less effective for the sheer amount of power, especially economic and financial power behind it. All right, that's one sector, the external ones. And then there are internal threats, and I would say they are manifesting themselves in countries like Hungary and Poland, where democracy has become proudly illiberal, because in their view, the internal threat to democracy comes from liberals who have turned illiberal. So, I reckon there is a contrary perspective, but I would say that indeed, if you look at what's happening in Hungary today, what might have happened in Italy if it hadn't been for the recent sudden change of government is actually a threat to the checks and balances, which are being undermined. I'm not going to stay with this topic. I'm just going to turn to a third one, which I find the most interesting one in this context here. And that is the increasing systemic divide between the Anglosphere and the rest of the West. Where, as usual, in all important conflicts, not only in politics, I have the theory that human conflict is really about reality. It's about who has their feet firmly on the ground and who is in la la land, and who owns the future and who is stuck in the past. And of course, now I'm saying it, the Brexit process over the last couple of years, And also, if you look at what's happening to the Republican Party in the United States and what's happening to the Conservative Party here in Britain, you have different ideas of the future. You have different ideas of who is delusionary, by the way, also between Britain and the continent. You said we speak different languages. That's a different way of expressing what I'm trying to say here, that we actually have different perceptions of what's real and what's illusion. So we need to acknowledge this difference in order to deal with it and make some constructive, to bring it to some kind of constructive conclusion, because the threats that are enumerated in this paper that we all got here and that we're going to discuss in detail tomorrow, these threats are not waiting for us to just automatically deal with them, but we have to tackle them actively. And so if I look a little bit at what's happening now in the US and in Britain, I'm less optimistic than my colleagues here about the two center-right forces, because I believe they have actually, they are stopping to be center-right. This is part of the Anglosphere versus the rest conflict in the Western group of countries. You know, frankly speaking, the Republican Party in the United States has been taken over by Trump, who originally was something like a third party, but due to the electoral system, he had to take over the Republican Party. And it's been Tea Partyized, if you want, although, of course, Trump is actually one rotation of the screw further away from the classical center-right than even the Tea Party. And I think if I read the situation right here in Britain, what Boris Johnson is trying with the Conservative Party is something similar. He is trying to actually transform it into something that it has never been. Resentment-driven, anti-elitist force with a very strange mixture of economic strategies, mixing neoliberalism and protectionism. Essentially anti-migration, a sovereignist, and even to the point of distrusting international institutions, and potentially opposed to checks and balances. You know, the enemies of the people headline, you remember that some time ago with the three judges on the cover of the British Daily, enemies of the people. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Boris Johnson is doing that to the House of Commons at this very moment. He's not using those words, but he is bringing direct democracy in counterposition to representative democracy. And that is going to the basis of checks and balances, and to have this in the oldest democracy in the world is indeed alarming. As I said, one element of this new divide between the Anglosphere and the rest is that the center-right has actually ceased to exist, or is about to cease to exist. Sorry to be so gloomy, but spot the German. Forgive me for that. I think it's my task here to bring a little bit of realism to the debate. So what's the conclusion? Now, obviously, well, governments will have to negotiate deals, and however Brexit will look like, we will get to some kind of structured relationship between the 27 and Britain. I hope the kingdom stays united, and we will have to, of course, cooperate in areas such as data, such as security, such as trade, and all the other fields that were mentioned here, environment and so on. But besides that, don't forget civil society. Well, actually, the IN2030 is one of the outgrowths of this effort to accompany the political attempt to deal with the challenges ahead, which are exacerbated through Brexit, to accompany them and complement them by an effort of civil society. Networks, think tanks, political parties, networks of individuals That is the stuff of which the future of the West is also made, beside government policy. So congratulations on this. And I think despite the gloominess that I try to inject here, I do think that we are still capable of coping with the main challenges ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, can you hear me better now? I've moved my mic the other side. Is that
Otherwise,
better?
you get it back.
Yeah, I'll get it back. The phrase, I'm going to pick particularly a phrase that you used, which is "correct me if I'm wrong," and I could see, some frowns and some quizzical looks on my left-hand side from both of you, to come back on some of the points that you made, particularly about populism in Britain.
There was one point, I think where I disagree with your view of reality, is that you seem to think that sort of Trump and Boris Johnson are much the same. And this is a widespread misapprehension, but it is a misapprehension. And very specifically, the two examples you use, I think, illustrate it perfectly. One of the big differences between the British government and the American government is about free trade. The Conservative Party under Boris Johnson is as committed to free trade as the Conservative Party ever has been. It's a big difference with Trump. And the other one, the very example you gave, immigration. This week, the British government has loosened our immigration controls. That announcement on student will absolutely mean that immigration will be higher under a Boris Johnson government than it was and would have been under a continuing Theresa May government. So actually, for any kind of superficial similarities about the fact that they both have unruly hair and use colourful language, actually Trump and Boris Johnson are very, very different politicians ideologically.
I agree with what Damon's saying, but I also, on top of that, I would say your view is very much the perspective of a white German. I was in the EU for 14 years, and one of the things that struck me was just the discrimination and I mean, if you wanted to see black faces in the EU institutions, you had to look at the cleaners or the security guards. You didn't see many people my colour or dark skin there. And the racism was there all the time around you. And what was very interesting for me was when I went to various EU countries talking to taxi drivers who tend to be immigrants. And whether in Belgium or in France or in Germany, and they would say to me, "Where are you from?" And I'd tell them I was from London. They say, "You're incredibly lucky. You're far more tolerant. These people here are racist." And I experienced that in the European Parliament many times, and it's much more subtle racism. There's two types of racism. There's people who say to you, "We hate you." In fact, in some ways, I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine the other day, "We prefer that. At least you know where you stand." And then there are the dinner party racists who are very nice to you, to your face, and very, but actually they make the odd comment about blacks or Jews in their own dinner parties and feel that superiority. And I think actually what's very interesting is when I speak to many, many people about immigration and our policy, we are becoming far more liberal. One of the arguments that many people are using is actually why have we been given priority to Europeans, mostly white Europeans, over mostly non-white, non-Europeans. What we should be selecting is people based on skills, hence a point system. So I strongly disagree with your view that actually we've become more anti-migration. I think we're going to have a fairer immigration system where we treat people from all around the world much more equally. And I think that's part of that skills issue, because we need the best skills and we want to attract the best skills in this country. And one of the things I really welcome, as Damien said, is actually, particularly being a professor now at the university, is the importance of soft power in terms of people who come to your country and study and then go home and become opinion formers in their country, whether they become politicians or business people. And I think that's a really important thing about thinking about future international relations, what was that. And I think the other issues, I think we will talk. Most of my friends, my friends from other countries who didn't want us to leave said to me, "Look, we'd rather you stayed. But of course we're going to have to talk. We're going to have to..." I think what happened is, in negotiations, the EU quite rightly played hardball, and the UK was too soft from my perspective. And one of the things that we did not understand, and I was in Brussels the day after the referendum, was that we did not understand that Britain voting to leave was not just seen as one country leaving. There was a whole question about the existential, I thought it was seen as an existential threat. If Britain left and made a success of it, would other countries also leave? And therefore, the EU being tough negotiators wasn't because they were being horrible, But actually, they were worried about this existential threat. And they wanted to send the signals to other countries that might be thinking of leaving that it's not going to be easy. And now the signal they can send is, if Britain can't leave, you know, none of you can leave, or it's made very difficult. It's interesting, some of those parties that you would call populists that were initially used to say Swexit, Sweden leaving or France leaving, actually took that out of their manifestos because it worked. That tough negotiating stance from the EU was very successful in sending that signal.
Oh, sorry, Roland, do you want to come back at that?
You know, as the minority here on the panel, I would like to strongly object to your presentation of, well, the negotiations and the question of, you know, why did exit from the European Union become unpopular, even with populist parties on the continent? That was not due to the negotiating style of Brussels or Mr. Barnier. That was due to the chaos that continental citizens observed in this country. That which was not caused by us. Sorry, you can blame us for a lot.
I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying it was a good.
Yeah, right.
It was a good negotiation.
Okay. Yeah, you
different languages.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming you. I actually think it was a good negotiating position. You know.
Okay. Anyway, no, but seriously, the fear wasn't that Britain would become a successful model for other countries leaving the European Union. The fear was that if Britain leaves, the other member states will want to demand this or that exception from what we call the acquis communautaire. Beautiful French word, you know, the legal achievements of decades of integration. So that then everyone would, if basically the European Union let Britain have the cake and eat it, and you remember that was even in a briefing for Theresa May at some point, and I think Boris Johnson actually used the term in some meetings. So if Britain was allowed to basically reap the benefits of the single market and even have some kind of co-determination power about European legislation, but take back control over its borders in terms of free movement, which was one of the 4 pillars of European integration, free movement of people, besides goods, capital, and what? Ideas, services. So if Britain was allowed to pick and choose, other people would demand to pick and choose. And that was the fear. You know, I know it's a popular and rather comforting in the current situation, a popular and comforting habit here on the island to say, well, they wanted to make Brexit a failure to scare their own skeptical countries like Denmark, Sweden, possibly France under Le Pen and so on, so that they would never dream of leaving the EU. I beg to differ. I beg to differ with that. That was not the idea why Angela Merkel and why the 27 actually held a common line, you know, which is something that no one here expected, not even Theresa May. So we stuck together because everyone knew that if we allow Britain to pick and choose, other countries will start their own demands of picking and choosing. And that would be indeed the end of integration as we know it. And that we could not allow. And that is why the 27 stayed united, and that is why Barnier could negotiate from an unexpectedly tough position, unexpected here on the island. So, you know, we have 2 different versions of reality here.